Hi everybody. This is the short and declassified version of a talk I gave earlier this month on skill-based matchmaking. First half is going to go into some technical details about skill ratings, which is probably going to bore some people, but is relevant to fully understanding matchmaking in Call of Duty. And the second half is going to focus on the topic du jour, which is, of course, Black Ops 7 and Treyarch's matchmaking debacle. So, it's going to be a lot of nuance here, which will inevitably get misinterpreted and misconstrued, but let's see how it goes. To start things off, if you're a truly casual player with a few hours to spend on gaming each week, you probably don't want to spend that time getting stomped by sweaty, no-life tryhards. So that's the motivation for SBMM. Which sounds like a reasonable idea, like this is innocuous enough, right? But as it turns out, there are quite a few people on the internet who don't see it that way. And while some of these complaints are misdirected, a lot of them are actually justified, so we'll get into that. First, let's back up and try to figure out how skill-based matchmaking should work in theory. While there might be a variety of applications and business objectives for it, at a minimum, SBMM should avoid making matches that'll be a waste of time. But the hard part is, how can we know if a match is going to be a waste of time? And this is where MMR comes in. Chess Elo is the most well-known attempt at an MMR system and has a lot of nice transparent properties, but to be clear, it is just a specific algorithm and most games don't actually use it. But it is a good starting point for this demonstration. So in a conventional ELO system, we might say an intermediate player is somewhere around 1200 MMR, while an advanced player is about 800 ELO higher at near 2000. And then just for reference, Magnus Carlsen is another 800 ELO above that. Which of these matches would be worth making? 2000 versus 1200, which is more than 99% win probability. So we can probably skip that. 400 MMR gap is still a 90% win rate. So like a 1 in 10 chance for an upset. So maybe that's worth playing, but probably not. But here, like a 200 MMR gap, that's probably okay. And then 164% win rate, that's definitely okay. But we are getting pretty close. Like the MMR gap is getting pretty small here. You might think all we have to do then is set our matchmaker to a maximum allowable gap of 200 ELO and everything's good. But not so fast, because ELO suffers from rating inflation when it's used for matchmaking. So these numbers, these actual win probabilities, become lower over time than what the MMR gaps predict they should be. And back in 2024, the International Chess Federation even had to manually adjust player ratings to account for this. And the problem with most MMR systems, most of them have flaws like this. So while systems like ELO and TrueScale are academically interesting and theoretically sound, they were only validated against static historical data. In other words, they were never tested against the feedback loop of real-world matchmaking. We see one or more flaws here. First, inflation, MMR inflation, which means the population distribution of MMR gets wider and flattens out over time. Second is drift, where the average MMR generally decreases over time, so the distribution keeps its shape but slides left. And then the third one is total model collapse, which is something that would happen if generative AI trains on its own output. In realistic simulations, we can see this pretty easily. Without SBMM, we get this narrow distribution here in yellow. But with SBMM, using the exact same virtual players, the ratings inflate and we get this wide, flat blue distribution here. And it just it's going to keep expanding out like this over time. ELO should work in theory, but under SBMM, the MMR gaps get close to zero, which weakens the training signal and amplifies flaws in the model, leading to the distribution of ratings to spread out over time. I'm not sure that the International Chess Federation looked at it, but SBMM was probably the root cause of their ELO problems. ELO is only stable under random matchmaking. Microsoft TrueScale has a similar problem, but step size decreases over time, which helps contain the inflation. You can see with SBMM, it doesn't get quite as wide here, but it has another problem. It drifts to the left, which it's not obvious from the static image, but here it's going to be this blue one here, kind of slides this way. But we'll see more data on this later. The most common problem with naive MMR systems, though, is got to be pure model collapse. The ratings essentially lose most of the useful information over time. And even COD had an actual MMR system like this in the early 2010s, just based on lifetime average KD. But it's not uncommon. A lot of studios attempt something similar. And it sort of makes sense because something like lifetime KD or lifetime win rate with random matchmaking is a perfect measure of skill, at least if real player skill didn't change and players never went off meta. So here we have random MMR histories of 5 simulated players using lifetime win rate. So we have a high skill player up here. You can see how this gets pretty flat. And a low skill player down here also flattens out. And you can see it's a strong, stable skill rating, at least when there's no SBMM. But with SBMM, the model collapses like this. So the ratings are only using a narrow fraction here of the total possible range, where it doesn't even make sense to compare a veteran player against a new player. And if you tighten the matchmaking to account for this collapse, to adjust for it, these ratings will actually just collapse even more. And I don't want to spend too much time on this other than to point out lifetime averages ultimately just make terrible MMR systems. So you could get clever and just use the running average, like if you use a sliding window of just the last 10 games. But even without SBMM, you'll just get noisy, uninformative values. Not completely uninformative, but mostly useless. And then if you try to use recent win rate for SBMM, it collapses into this noisy, mostly useless mess. But games really will still try to do this. The point of all that is there are a lot of bad options out there for MMR, and we need to come up with something better. But before we come up with the specific properties or requirements that the MMR system should have, we should first think about the use cases. The most obvious use case is skill-based matchmaking, determining whether a match is worth making. Slightly less obvious is how it informs or shapes the macro player experience. Like, should new players who are very bad on average, maybe 10th percentile, should they be thrown in the middle of the pool where most of them will get wrecked, or should they start off against similarly low skill players? And then what happens when players go on losing streaks? Like maybe they decide to grind pistol camos. Should the MMR adapt aggressively like it does in Call of Duty, or should we let players suffer, or something in between? And the third thing is player feedback and rewards, which most obviously includes ranked play. But the thing I've been trying to preach is that casual design needs to think about the matchmaking design, about skill. These aren't two separate systems. These are actually intertwined systems, and they need to be treated as part of the entire casual player experience. And then finally, there's analytics. MMR should be able to predict outcomes reliably, like the meaning of MMR shouldn't change over time. The same MMR number should map to the same skill percentile, like the real skill percentile, even after months or years. And then, of course, all of this is complicated by needing to work in multiplayer games, not just 1v1, with teams and parties, which leads to the properties that the ideal MMR system should have. So it shouldn't have the 3 flaws that we already talked about. It shouldn't have inflation, drift, or collapse. I would also add that it should be elastic. I mean, you can start a player anywhere in the distribution and have them predictably arrive where they belong. So like for a new player. And it should also be intuitive. So the rating changes need to be explainable and transparent. Kind of like ELO, but definitely not like TrueScale. Maybe that's a tall order though, because there is no MMR system out there that meets all of these requirements. Call of Duty's MMR system is close. It meets the first 4 requirements, but it's not intuitive. And it has some bad properties, which we're going to examine in part 2. Which means it's probably a good time to talk about invocation and what we do. So IVK skill is our proprietary MMR system, which was designed to meet all of these requirements and which we're in the process of patenting. Believe it or not, this isn't intended to be a sales pitch. Yes, this is what I do professionally. This is what my company does, and I love to brag about our MMR algorithms. But what I want to show here are the flaws with the most common MMR systems and demonstrate that solutions are possible to address those flaws. So this graph looks at MMR inflation, the first problem we looked at with ELO. And the x-axis is simulation time. The y-axis is the standard deviation of MMR in the population, so the width of the distribution, in other words. And over time, with SBMM, you can see ELO, this blue line here, keeps inflating. Open skill or true skill both slow their inflation over time, but never quite stops, while IVK skill hits a firm limit. And this is good because we want a stable long-term shape to the MMR distribution. The second flaw we talked about earlier was distribution drift, so shifting of the distribution to the left over time. And pure ELO without any scaling factor, K factor, or clamping at zero is zero sum. So any MMR you gain, someone else loses, which means the MMR doesn't change over time. The mean MMR doesn't change over time. True skill, on the other hand, is not zero sum. That's why the average MMR decreases over time as new players come in and generally improve. That pushes the distribution to the left. This is bad though, because it causes new incoming players to be increasingly overrated. It's also an unstable foundation for ranked play and then problematic for long-term analytics. IVK skill, on the other hand, as a stable, predictable long-term mean. The distribution has to inflate initially, which is why MMR increases here, but as a predictable, stable asymptote. This isn't just theoretical. We see this in real player data too. The mean, which is this blue line for IVK skill, and the standard deviation, which is this green line. These are both stable, meaning the population distribution can be accurately modeled long term. And this is great, for example, if you're designing a ranked play system and say you want to show players their real MMR. And speaking of real MMR, this is a distribution of real player MMR. Skill distribution in a lot of games will probably be similar to this. What surprises a lot of people is that this is not a normal distribution or even symmetrical. The real distribution of skill in most games tends to be skewed like this. Like if a game has a symmetrical MMR distribution, like the classic bell curve, it either doesn't have a healthy influx of new players or it has a crap MMR system. Something interesting is that over half of the player base falls into these three low skill buckets here, while the top 10%, say top 7%, are spread across these 4 or 5 high skill buckets here. What this means is there's more difference in real skill between a 90th and a 99th percentile player, so between two very, very good players, than there is between a 10th percentile and a 50th percentile player. Or another way to look at it is that even if you're in the 86th percentile of players, like a really good player, maybe the equivalent of a D1 athlete, you're still only half as skilled as an elite pro player. It's sort of like what Brian Scalabrine said, if you ever watch his videos. He could be the worst player in the NBA, but he's still closer to LeBron than you are to him. So something to keep in mind is that if you're a good player, say 75th percentile, then without skill-based matchmaking, on average, 25% of your lobby is going to be made up of these players. And they're a lot better than you, disproportionately better. But down here, the bulk of the players who are worse than you are still closer to your skill than you are to these top players. So this is going to feel sweaty any way you look at it. What you might be asking, though, is how can we be so confident that MMR is representative of real skill? We have that confidence because the real outcomes match the predictions made by the skill model. So on the x-axis here, we have what we thought would happen, where we thought you would rank in the match. And then on the y-axis is what actually happened, or how you actually performed on average, given these expectations. Again, this is not a sales pitch, but this is IVK skill data. COD's MMR is not this tightly calibrated, if calibrated at all. So we know the distribution of MMR that we were just looking at, this one up here. We know this distribution is accurate because the outcomes match the predictions across all of the skill buckets and not just on average across all players. What we're looking at here is the very top sliver of players, the most elite 99.99% of players. But then as we jump down through the buckets, we can see that this calibration lines up almost perfectly across all these different skill groups. Overall, this is a remarkably accurate model of real player skill. There's a little bit of compression at the extremes, and you can see the artifacts here, but this is about as accurate as you can get with a single simple MMR number. So how do these skill models work under the hood? Well, in a modified ELO or vanilla true skill system, first we take all the player MMRs for each team and figure out how we expect the teams to perform. Basically, what's the probability that your team will win? Then we look at the team scores to see what actually happened, converting this into a simple 1.0 for a win, 0 for a loss, 0.5 for a tie. And finally, we update everyone's MMR based on the residual, so based on the difference between the actual outcome and what we expected to happen. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, especially for true skill, but abstractly, high level, that's how it works. Of course, I can't share any details about how COD's proprietary MMR system works, but I will just say it's very different than ELO or true skill. I can, however, talk about the IVK skill model. It's a little more complicated than the others. We model party interactions to build our team model. We create expectations for individual player performance, throw in some secret sauce, and then merge all of these submodels together with more secret sauce, and then that gets boiled down to a single updated MMR number. But in each step of this pipeline, we produce expectations and outcomes which could be used for analytics or even shown to players directly or indirectly. So we have a well-calibrated player performance model, and then from that same MMR, we can also predict team results. But then we combine the player model and the team model into a unified model with another layer of predictions and outcomes. Okay, I'll make this quick, but it's kind of interesting. The IVK skill system is elastic, which means new players can start at the average MMR for a new player and then improve over time. So here we have a graph of median MMR by number of games played. And for this particular game, you can see just how dramatically new players improve over time. So there's some selection bias too, like in here. Really bad players will inevitably churn out at high rates early on. But over time, over a number of games, you can see players keep getting better and better relative to the general population. Okay, the last technical topic before we get into the spicy stuff. This is going to be a little bit of insight into how we handle team modeling at Invocation versus how most other games handle it. There's more to team modeling than just this, but it raises an interesting question, which is a team the sum of its parts? So on the left here, we have two 1,000 rated players, and together they make a 2,000 rated team. And then on the right, we have a less skilled 500 player with a more skilled 1,500 player, and we're trying to figure out what should their combined skill be as a team. So I'll make it a multiple choice. Is the team MMR going to be 2,000, the sum of the parts? Will it be 2462, so more than the sum of the parts, or 1537, less than the sum? And the answer depends on the team model, and that depends on the game. So the Greek letters here are just to make this look intimidating, but it's really not that complicated. What we're doing here is exponential weighting. So, and there's just one variable here, this k variable, to control the bias of that weighting. If k is 0, the player weights all just go to 1. So every player just contributes their skill directly. And this is the same thing as adding up the MMRs, which is what most games do to model skill. And we call this a neutral link team model. So purely additive team MMR. But if k is a positive number, say it's 1, which would be on the extreme end, then the higher skill players carry more weight. So this is how we might model a pickup basketball game where one superstar can make all the difference. All you have to do is just get him the ball. Or if k is -1, then the weakest skill player carries more weight. So it becomes a weak link model. And this is something like if you're playing volleyball where the weak link can be exploited. This is how we would model that. Of course, it gets more complicated, especially in sports where positions are not all the same or games different roles, but it's something to think about, at least to get an idea of what goes into the skill models that drive MMR. All right, that's enough technical talk. Let's get into current events. For context, I put together most of this content before Black Ops 7 launched, but at the end, I've appended a few slides talking about the post-launch. A few things you should know about me. I developed Call of Duty's casual MMR system, the one that's been in mainline since 2016, but it originated with COD Online back in 2014. I also want to mention I did the math for World War II's rank play, which is, in my honest opinion, the only good ranking system that COD has ever had, objectively speaking. And also I did the dynamic aim response curve, just to point out that I did some things that players don't totally hate. But like any good matchmaking story, this one begins with XDefiant. You probably all remember that XDefiant was Ubisoft's COD killer. And the big reason why it was going to kill COD was because XDefiant didn't use skill-based matchmaking. But as we all know, 6 months later, the game was canceled. The reason XDefiant was shut down was because it had terrible retention. The reality is the lack of SBMM may have attracted players to the game, but it didn't give the best chance to succeed in the very demanding free-to-play market. The reason XDefiant didn't have SBMM, though, at least according to Mark Rubin, was because he wanted players to have a varied experience. So sometimes you stomp, sometimes you get stomped. And within a month and a half after XDefiant launched, Activision came out with a matchmaking white paper, the second matchmaking white paper, saying actually SBMM was critical to player retention. And if Mark Rubin's goal was to give players a more varied experience, that's exactly what SBMM does. To quote the paper, Call of Duty's matchmaking increases the variety of outcomes experienced by players of all skill levels. So after Activision called out Mark Rubin's folly, can you guess what happened next? Treyarch announced they would follow in XDefiant's footsteps and push low SBMM matchmaking with the same goal of providing players with a more varied experience. In fairness to both of these games, removing SBMM was not just pure stupidity. It was partly out of desperation, but a lot of the decisions that were made because the designers just didn't understand how SBMM works. And matchmaking is a complicated system with a lot of nuance to it. So maybe the best way to examine some of that nuance is to go through 5 of the most common complaints. I can't relax and have fun. I can't play with my friends. Every match feels the same. Matchmaking feels rigged. There's no sense of improvement. I can't relax and have fun. It's probably the most common complaint, but it's actually an example of inverted perception. Most of the time when players blame SBMM for sweaty matches, it's actually the opposite. Matches feel sweaty when SBMM is loose or otherwise ineffective. SBMM is exactly what allows most players to relax and have fun. And I know there's going to be some cognitive dissonance here. So let's break it down with some pictures. Imagine 4 players without SBMM represented by these 4 normalish distributions. So down here we have a low skill player whose performances are going to land within this red distribution. Right down here. On average right about here, and then 2 players in the middle, and then up at the top, a high skill player whose performances are going to fall within this gold distribution. Without SBMM, which of these players can relax and have fun? So gold can for sure, because even with a relatively bad performance, like down at this tail, it's still pretty unlikely that the blue player will perform better, meaning gold will usually be the best player in the match, or almost certainly in the top 2, barring some kind of black swan event. The red player, however, at their current skill level, has no chance of being in the top half of the match in terms of personal performance. They can always get good, of course, but that's not really casual or relaxing then, and we'll come back to that. By contrast, if players have more matches like this, then blue has a pretty good chance of being the best player in the match, which is fun for them, and so does green. And even red has a chance, even though it's not likely, but that is still going to be more fun for them. Unfortunately for gold, however, they're not guaranteed to be the best player in the match anymore, and that is the real problem that needs to be addressed. So the real question is, who can't relax and have fun? To put some numbers on it, consider if you're below the 75th percentile in skill in the entire population, SBMM can only improve your chances of being the top 3 in a match. And if you're below the 91st percentile in skill, so the vast majority of players, SBMM can only improve your chances of being the best player in the match. It's only the top 9% who mathematically get no upside. SBMM can only increase their chances of not being the best player in the match. And Activision's A/B test results are consistent with this. Retention for the top 10% of players improves without SBMM, but for everybody else, it decreases. So coming back to this, you might be thinking tight SBMM looks sweaty because if green, blue, or gold slips up or takes a moment to breathe and relax, then someone else is right there at their heels. And that would be the case if MMR didn't adapt. But that's not COD's problem, at least not for most players. So if you take it easy or go off meta, or just have a bad match, COD's MMR will adapt so that the next match is easier. Now every game out there works this way though, so This is a legit problem with games using true skill or open skill for MMR. And on the left here, we have simulated MMR histories of 6 players using open skill, basically true skill. And you can see how the ratings end up relatively flat. Once it's determined your skill, true skill is very unforgiving. So if you have a few bad games, you will keep suffering or stomping through the same lobbies. This property is also what makes it super easy to smurf in games using vanilla true skill. Just play as bad as possible in early matches and then get hundreds or thousands of easy matches after that. The opposite extreme though is COD's MMR. So this isn't exactly COD's algorithm, but if you compare it to the MMR data players have gotten from Activision GDPR requests, it'll look basically the same. And you can see how volatile this is. If anything, COD's MMR adapts too much, but we'll come back to that. All right, maybe the second most common complaint is that higher skilled players can't play in a party with lower skilled friends. And this is true. Call of Duty should probably fix this. And this happens partly because of the way Call of Duty evaluates team balance. On the left we have Team 1 with a 900 rated player and a 100 rated player, so total team MMR of 1,000. And then on the right, we have a team with average players, say 500 and 500, also with a team MMR of 1,000. So this is probably how it works with Call of Duty. You just add these two numbers together and you get the team MMR. The difference between the teams is 0. And theoretically, that looks like a great match, but it isn't. And I guarantee you've played in matches like this where you have a high skill player teamed up with a low skill player playing against a team of average players. And on paper, it looks like a great match, but in reality, it's not. So what Call of Duty should be doing is evaluating by absolute error or mean squared error. So absolute error, we would take the highest skilled players on both teams, so 900 and 500, find the difference between them, then the next two players, 100 and 500, that's a difference of 400, and then take the difference between the total team MMRs, which is 0 in this case. But when you add all this error together, we see it's 800, not 0. So a better match would be a team with an 800 and a 200 versus 900 and 100. Now we only have an error of 200. If you slide team 2 down so that it's a 700, 100, now you have this difference in total team MMR, and that increases the error. Perfect match, of course, would be matching the shape on the left side with the shape on the right side. So 900 versus 900, 100 versus 100. An even bigger problem is the way Call of Duty models parties. So if you're the low skill player in a party, so if you had a 900 and 100, a big skill disparity, this 100 player would get rounded up to the highest MMR in their party. So the team balancer is going to look at this like this is an 1800 rated team, and it's going to try to find another team that's also 1800. So you're going to have a 900 and a 100 player versus two 900s. And this is going to feel extra bad for the low skill player here, assuming they're not a smurf. So this is solvable. I don't have a visualization ready for it, but basically instead of pulling everyone into a lobby first and then balancing teams from those players in the lobby, the matchmaker needs to treat every match like a backfill and create teams as it goes. So at every step, the matchmaker has to ask, who would be the best addition to this match? If there's only one player in the match, then it would try to find another player similar to that player and put them on the other team. Likewise, if there's a party on one team, it wants to find a similar party for the other team. That's easier said than done, but that's the basic idea of how to fix this. So the third common complaint, every match feels the same. We heard this from Mark Rubin and from Treyarch's Twitter account. They all want players to have a more varied experience. But what do they mean by varied experience? Because some of these are mutually exclusive. They probably don't mean variety in team outcomes, but if they do want more blowout matches, just get rid of team balancing. So we'll skip that one. Maybe they mean variety of skills within the match though. This is definitely what the top 10% of players want, because more variety of skills means they get to do more stomping more consistently. But then again, the way Mark Rubin described variety was sometimes you get stomped, sometimes you do the stomping. So we must be talking about the variety of personal outcomes. We've touched on this before, but just to hammer this point again, personal outcome variety is proportional to the fluctuations in individual performance. So like this width here, oh, great illustration, relative to the total variety of skill within the match. So looking at like this total width here as the denominator. Assuming you don't want more RNG, the only way you can increase personal outcome variety then is by decreasing the variety of skill within the match. So you have to decrease this denominator. The cognitive dissonance, again, is going to be real, but the best way to add variety to player experiences is more SBMM, not less. Not only does tighter SBMM make your personal outcome more varied, it makes your place in the composition of the match more varied. So some matches you'll be the gold player, some matches you'll be the red player, but either way you have a chance at being the best performer in the match. This happens because when we pick players out of a narrow slice of the population, that slice more closely resembles a uniform distribution. And the closer a distribution is to uniform, the more randomness it has. Without SBMM though, the matchmaker will pick players from the entire population, meaning wherever you are in this distribution is where you'll fall on average in each match. To be charitable, what Mark Rubin and a lot of players think they want is a variety of skills within the match, like more randomness of match composition. I don't have a slide for this, but that scenario happens when you have low concurrent player counts and a real diversity of skill, which happens either in niche communities or in the good old days before dedicated servers, both of which are not exactly compatible with a healthy AAA game. But to repeat from earlier, if MMR doesn't adapt, then yeah, every match could feel the same. You could definitely get locked into the same type of matches with true skill, but COD again has the opposite problem. It adapts too much, which leads right into the next complaint. Matchmaking feels rigged. And that's because it is. Well, it's not rigged in the sense that it's micromanaged. It's rigged in the sense that there's too much volatility. Specifically, there's too much reactivity. So volatility implies randomness, but there's too much reactivity, especially in the mid-range. So you can see it here, like in this orange player, where they drop a few matches, their MMR tanks, and then they rebound. The idea behind it, though, is to break losing streaks by adapting MMR to recent performance rather than using heavy-handed, prescribed mechanical streak-breaking rules. We've already looked at how the behavior of a COD-like system compares to the stagnation of a true skill-like MMR system, like on the left here, but I haven't mentioned IVK skill in a while. So this is how IVK compares with exactly the same virtual players. It still adapts to good or bad performances, but that adaptation can be controlled without destabilizing the distribution. So it doesn't have that whiplash effect that COD has. And while I'm bragging about IVK skill, this is a number that can be shown and explained to players directly or indirectly, certainly in the combat record at least. The issue you'll see in the GDPR data with COD's MMR is that it can decrease even when you win and even when you're on top of the scoreboard. Behavior of COD's MMR isn't intuitive if players can see it, so that might be part of the reason why Activision isn't transparent about it. The biggest reason why Activision doesn't show MMR though is that multiplayer designers just don't think about it. It's not part of the daily development and playtesting. They're just focused on the in-game mechanics and the balance of the game. I'm sure you've seen or heard devs deflect on skill-based matchmaking questions as though it was imposed on them by the evil Activision overlords to make some poor YouTuber's life miserable. But that's not really how it is. The studios just don't understand how it works or what their options are. Related to COD's lack of transparency, the last complaint I'll look at least in this video, is that there's no sense of improvement. And this is a valid complaint. Here, we just have simulation data, and it's probably a bit more extreme than what COD actually has, but it illustrates the point. So without SBMM, you can see this purple line. As your skill improves, your average outcome increases linearly, and this would be something noticeable to players. With SBMM, though, there's only a gradual increase in outcome, this blue line here, and it's even less noticeable in the middle. So mid-skill players are going to have a tough time figuring out if they're getting better or not. Again, this is not COD's data, and I expect this line would be a little steeper in reality, but if SBMM is working, it inevitably dampens the feedback for getting better. So how can games give players a sense of improvement? One option is just weaker SBMM or no SBMM, open matchmaking. You could do this. It's a viable design decision for some games, but it's probably only going to work in games with a lot of randomness, like roguelike weapon leveling, low time to kill, or some other mechanism to close the skill gap. Or it could work in premium games that aren't live service, where it doesn't really matter if players stick around, because this will put churn pressure on new and casual players. If you want new and casual players to stick around though, and you want players to have a sense of improvement, you'll need to work with SBMM. It's not enough to pretend that matchmaking is a completely self-contained system. You have to pair it with skill-based design, which maybe is a dirty word also. The meta systems, I mean like the progression systems, need to coordinate with the matchmaking design. These are not two separate pillars. These have to be connected. I realize that recognizing problems is a lot easier than knowing how to fix them, so it's not my intention to prescribe to designers exactly how to do their job. I just want to point out that there are solutions out there. So what's the way out for Activision and Treyarch here? It seems to me like they have three options. They can either stay the course, which is going to continue to tank retention and revenue. They could try to undo the changes and go back to the way things were, which is just going to outrage the vocal influencers they were trying to appease in the first place. Or they can finally start designing with skill in mind and maybe save the franchise. Bonus material. I put this presentation together several weeks before BO7 launched, so some things have changed since then. Like, I thought Black Ops would have a pretty decent launch and then lose casual players early on and miss out on long-term Battle Pass revenue, but as it turns out, the launch was a lot worse than expected, and that's of course independent of the matchmaking, other than to say the lure of open matchmaking was a failed Hail Mary. So in my view, the doomsday clock is accelerated, and I would guess that without casual fodder, BO7 has moved on to losing core players now. And some players are leaving because they thought this tweet meant SBMM had been completely removed from the game, and then they felt betrayed by the inclusion of one standard matchmaking playlist, and then blamed it for stealing away fodder from the open playlist. But what's really going on here is there aren't enough casual players at launch to make open matchmaking the pub stomp that was expected or promised. So if open lobbies are sweaty, it's because it's mostly sweats playing. Open matchmaking really does have minimal skill consideration, and you can be sure that standard matchmaking isn't pulling too many players yet, because most casual players just want the one or two modes they're most comfortable with, not a mosh pit. So if you're looking for noobs to stomp, my advice would be try the open TDM playlist. That's probably the best place to look. I'm also pretty sure selecting multiple playlists is going to match you with other players looking for the lowest pop mode in your list, which means you'll get sweaty players, not casuals. So until the noobs churn out and quit forever, your best chance to find low skill players to stomp is to search the open TDM exclusively. At least that's my best guess. The reason I think searching multiple playlists will tend to pick the one with the lowest population is because that's the way, in theory, that Activision can avoid playlist starvation now that persistent lobbies are back. So this is another slide I made pre-launch but didn't quite fit into the main presentation. But the point here is persistent lobbies are going to make matchmaking difficult, especially with low CCU. The reason MW 2019 switched to disbanding lobbies was to avoid playlist starvation while improving player connections. And to make sense of that, the first thing to realize is that Activision has a lot of data centers. And this is a good thing. Like, the intent here is that as many players as possible can have low latency connections to a DEDI. The second thing to realize is that there are a lot of game modes and playlists to choose from. Multiplied together, that fragments your matchmaking significantly because now the matchmaker has to find players with similar playlist preferences and compatible data center options. Which leads to the latest conspiracy theory I've seen, that Activision lied about removing SBMM from open matchmaking. And this usually comes with three pieces of evidence. 1, open lobbies are sweaty. 2, wait times are longer than in the beta. And 3, connections are worse than in the beta. But those are just trade-offs from bringing back persistent lobbies for launch, assuming they don't want low pop playlists to starve. It gets worse though, it gets more complicated because when players leave a lobby now, there are even fewer options for how to replace them since the lobby is already committed to a data center. Keep in mind, I'm not representing Activision. These are just my best guesses about what's happening. They may have the ability to move lobbies between servers now, and I wouldn't know, although I'm kind of surprised they haven't commented about the trade-offs that persistent lobbies require. Regardless, persistent lobbies make matchmaking more difficult any way you look at it. So you're going to see increased wait times, worse match quality, and even if latency is the only quality requirement. All right, that's about all I'm going to cram into this video. I'm going to conclude with some relatively safe predictions. First one, Black Ops 7 is just going to get sweatier. The only way it won't is if there's more churn pressure on higher skilled players than on everyone else, which is unlikely but not impossible given the current mass disillusionment with the game. But if I had to guess, it's going to get sweatier and the player count is going to crater a lot like XDefiant. Treyarch, in spite of that, will not switch the default back to standard matchmaking or even add playlists to standard matchmaking. I think if there had been more players at launch, I think they would have done that. I think they would have done both when they saw that retention tanked, but now they might as well just ride open matchmaking to the ground. Third, unfortunate but relatively safe prediction is something's got to give at Xbox. For sure, they're going to try pumping more AI slop into games to cut costs and then artificially inflate demand for generative AI. But I wouldn't be surprised if they close down some Activision studios, maybe including Treyarch, and then maybe they move to a 2-year release cycle. So we'll see. All right, that's all I got for this presentation, but I look forward to all your questions and comments and hate mail.